This map, the London Underground map, is surely one of the most well-known pieces of cartography in the world. It represents our modern life better than almost any other map out there. It's a study in paradoxes. It's confusing but clear, abstract but practical, simple but complex, and it defines the ways we navigate huge cities today. In this episode, we're going to explore the history of the London Tube map, its particular design choices, its impact on how we see our cities, and where it stands as a useful tool these days. At first glance, this map, despite being aesthetically pleasing, is pretty much just completely incomprehensible to a newcomer just trying to get somewhere in London. The map requires you to understand the context of underground rail systems, and something about how the city the map is set in is laid out. You need to know quite a bit about where you are and where your destination is. This map is built for a very specific purpose, and that purpose is how to navigate the tube system itself. Navigating the city on top of it is a totally different job. To understand how this map got so restrictive and why it still works so well at the same time, we need to journey a bit through the history of the London Underground and its riders. The history of this underground map in general is already covered brilliantly in Jay Foreman's series on it, so I'll try to just go over it briefly, focusing on understanding the reasons behind different changes in the map. So let's get started in the later part of the 1800s. The early development of London City rail systems is a jumbled one. Different companies operated different lines under different permits and served different parts of the city. This wasn't any kind of planned or cooperative affair. Therefore, of course, maps of the systems weren't put together as a conglomerate either. So in the early years, you just had to get to know your way around. What stations were where, how they connected, how to buy tickets. Simple as that. But the underground rail lines proved very popular. People from all walks of life started to use them to journey around the city. And so slowly, the disparate companies began to move towards unification, and part of this was publishing a common map. They had already been publishing maps with lines printed over the city, things like this which were pretty useful overall, like seeing a highway and where you could get off. This was great for a city that hadn't yet been navigating by tube for very long and still saw the city from an above-ground perspective. Finally, after a few decades in 1908, the various rail lines came together and put out a common map. That's this one. Now, this map, and other early maps that come before the modern tube map, get a lot of flack today as being too busy and crazy and cramped. But at this point in history, I think we actually have to give a lot of credit to this design. It shows boldly colored lines laid out on a map of London with stations clearly marked. This would have been comprehensible to people at the time who knew their city more by maps than by rail stations alone. The map does get a little stuffy in places, and the labels aren't always very clearly tied to specific stations, especially in the center, but it's really not so bad. It's still good to know the actual relative distance between the stations if you need to know roughly where in the city you're going to wind up. I think this map shows a city that is slowly moving towards seeing London as something underground, where stations are growing in importance but aren't yet top priority. We also see some different designs of this that came along in 1910 and 1911, and particularly in this one in 1911, we can see how the design is actually very clean and easy to read. This design is actually a bit ahead of its time in removing some of the street details, but still keeping the clear geographic layout of London. Other designs, like this particular one from 1910, are more stuffy, and even in this early version, additional things like the Army and Navy store are included, making it a little less readable, but maybe more useful to people at the time. As we go further on, though, this general map framework gets tougher to manage. And once we hit 1920, these designs and their derivatives are starting to crumble under their own weight. And along comes MacDonald Gill with his 1921 map that completely removes the underlying map of London. This change lays the groundwork for the London map we know of today, and really speaks to a change in the way that Londoners were thinking about the city. In Gill's map, the world above the tube is something everyone already knows. Everyone knows where the stations come up. Londoners must be speaking to each other more by stations than by streets or intersections. People meet at stations. People locate places by how far they are from stations. Stations are the anchor points of the city for the average daily person navigating the tube. London itself is changing. It's turning into a network of rail nodes. Gill's innovation of fading the background of the map of London to nothing solves many problems of the busyness of the map, but he didn't make any additional leap of actually moving the stations around. They still have the same layout as if the map was still there underneath. So the map is actually kind of brutal. You have to get right up to it and squint to be able to read it, and I must say I'm not a huge fan of the font. There were numerous redesigns made in the next decade, by Fred Stingemore, for example, that really moved the dial closer to the London Underground map we know today. Just check out this map. The fonts are those that we are used to now, the bold colored lines. Spacing is more regular between stations. Symbols at interchange stations and non-interchange stations are familiar, and there's no underlying map. Yet, it's still obvious at this point that the map is starting to fall apart in terms of readability, especially in the center, where it's pretty damn rough. Curiously, it doesn't seem like this was actually a huge deal to anyone. There wasn't some big call to fix the map, no public outcry or calls for submissions. That's one thing about innovation or improvement. People don't always know what they need to be improved. So when I suddenly flip the page to Harry Beck's 1933 version of his tube map, it's kind of shocking. You can almost instantly feel the strain come off your eyes. Everything is immediately aesthetically easy. Nice, clean lines, pleasing angles, simple fonts. It's familiar enough using many of Stingemore's design elements, but very different too. It ends up being a little weird, otherworldly, even confusing despite being pretty. And this is because Beck wasn't trained as a cartographer. He was an electrical engineer, so he was bringing that thinking to his mapping. Beck worked with the tube in the 1920s before losing his job as part of broader funding cuts. But he was one of those people who just loved the underground and found a hobby in working with its maps. As an electrical engineer, he was very familiar with electrical diagrams, like these ones, which had become a common language between engineers since the early 1900s. These diagrams were still relatively recent as a method of communicating schematic layouts of circuitry, and it wasn't until 1909 that common diagrammatic norms and symbols were developed and standardized. So Beck, becoming an engineer in a time when these diagrams were finally solidified and becoming widespread, was used to seeing how they could lay out complex twists of wires and connections in a way that was still comprehensible. Beck brought the standardization of schematics to his map. He stuck to using only vertical, horizontal, and 45-degree angles, clear colors, and he experimented with different symbols for different kinds of stations. It's like he placed everything on a clean grid. He had a clear legend and left everything else off, so you could follow everything easily, just like an engineer hooking up a piece of equipment would do. In fact, we tend to describe Beck's maps as schematics or diagrams more than maps. They show the tube in a sort of ideal or exploded view, not exactly how it corresponds to real-world space. Beck knew what he was doing here, and he played around with the electrical metaphor in the early days, making a joke map one time with Bakelite, a type of plastic that was hugely important in electrical applications, substituted for the station of Bakerloo. Interestingly, this wasn't actually the first map for a metro system designed like this. The first that we know of is one designed for Berlin's S-Bahn in 1931, which uses the octilinear design of vertical, horizontal, and 45-degree angles. Beck did make his very first version that we know of in 1931, but this was already actually in use in Berlin. So it seems like this process of reimagining the map seemed to have been happening concurrently in different places. It wasn't just one man with a crazy idea coming out of nowhere. In any case, in London, Beck was apparently the right man doing the right design at the right time, even though no one really understood how much they actually wanted what he was making. The first design, the one I just mentioned in 1931, was first rejected, but he tried again, and his later 1933 version, which we regard as his first map, was accepted with reservations and ended up being rather grudgingly put out in a small circulation with an apologetic invitation for comments stamped on the front. The maps were gone within an hour, and people have hardly looked back since. Beck, then 31 and not working in any official capacity for the Tube, wasn't mentioned anywhere on the map, and got about 10 guineas for his work, something around £800 today. And yet he kept doing designs for years and years, despite never being officially employed by the Tube. It's a bit of a strange story, and sad at times, this unofficial map maker working in the shadows for decades as the Tube grows and changes, updating and sending versions of the map to be modified, rejected, or appropriated as the company wanted. They never really respected his work, and would employ other designers who ended up needing their work to be fixed by him. They'd ignore his requests for control and refuse to acknowledge him in any official capacity. In the end, today, Beck is widely recognized for his work, but I imagine that he became bitter despite the enormous success of his design. On another level, though, Beck's design really highlights the way that Londoners could now completely separate the world above the Tube from the Tube itself. They didn't need any context for the stations. They already had pictures in their minds of where these places popped up and what could be accessed near them. The stations were portals. You step through one side, ride through the wires of the schematic, and come out the other side into the world again. London, once knowable by streets, was now a place defined by underground stations. Let's talk a bit more about the map itself. We already know some of the considerations that had to go into the creation and design of the map. The map had to show a large number of stations spread out across a wide geographic area, sometimes interconnected and tightly packed, and sometimes very far apart. The map had to fit on a reasonable sized piece of paper, not something super wide or super tall, be easy for the average person to look at a glance, and, most importantly, actually provide value to the users of the map. That is, it had to help people figure out how to get where they wanted to go, what lines they had to take to get there, and where to change lines. This is obviously a lot to ask for. Beck's map clearly has strengths. I think best of all, and the reason it sold out, is that it hits the user's needs. It's aesthetically pleasing, definitely, but that's just a bonus. Most of all, it makes it easy to see the different stations, count how many there are, and see the interchanges. I think part of Beck's genius here was his ability to completely disconnect the Tube map from the above-ground layout of London, but yet still retain a very general sense of the city's geographical space, using the Thames River to help anchor the user in the real world. The map still does represent the city, it's just squished and distorted. You still do know what lines go roughly in what direction, and above all, you really just need to know the portals, where the underground breaks through to the surface. On this level, the map can be disorienting if you're not familiar with the stations in the city. You can get the wrong idea of the way stations are laid out. Here's a map of the London Tube today mapped in a geographically accurate way. Which, by the way, I don't think this map is actually that bad, but you do have to zoom in a lot to see everything. Looking at this map and comparing it to the exploded circuit view, you see that there are a lot of ways to screw up where you're going if you don't already know the stations. For example, Bayswater looks south of Paddington, directly south, but it's not, it's west. White City is almost directly north of Shepherd's Bush, not west of it. West Hampstead is actually closer to Queen's Park than it is to Willesden Green, but you'd never know it. These discrepancies aren't jarring to someone who already knows the city, but they are fairly confusing to someone new to the Tube or just trying to navigate between stations. As the years have gone on too, the original clean map is suffering from a similar problem to the original Tube map from 1908. Where that original map served its users well, the Tube got out of hand for it. Beck's map has also served very well, but as the Tube has grown, it's been very difficult to keep everything in order. All the redesigns in the decades after show that, and more than anything, today's massive Tube map is a glaring example of the design being pushed to its limits. This map is real tough to fit on the back of a flyer like those of the early days. Yet we're still sticking to Beck's original ideas and schematic designs, almost 100 years later, even though the London Tube has somewhat outgrown it. There are hundreds of different things on the map now, from stations to rail lines to accessibility, fare zones, different labels, and it's getting more complex all the time. The same problem is happening with all the other metros around the world that have adopted this type of map. They're almost insanely complex. Just imagine looking at these for the first time and trying to find a single station. The tourist experience, therefore, speaks well to the complexities of these modern underground maps. It takes quite a few minutes just to get a handle on where you are, let alone where you have to go, how many lines are required, what fares you have to pay to get there, and how to do the interchanges. These cities all, to varying degrees, mimic the underlying design of the London Tube system. It's actually quite incredible to see how widespread this design has become. Basically, if you have a city and you have a metro system, you're making a map like Beck's. Yet, how we do directions today has changed drastically with the use of smartphones. Generally, we'll maybe look up the address of a place we're trying to go and then enter where we're coming from. The map will spit out directions with lines on a map and maybe some written instructions too. The written instructions can help us get somewhere pretty well, but if we try to figure out the tube map ourselves by trying, let's say, to find the closest station to our destination on Google Maps, we'll be in more trouble. We're going to look at maps splattered with icons, overloaded with information on small screens, and maybe we don't even have proper internet because we're underground. Again, the station maps provide us with an effective means of navigating the metro, but not necessarily navigating the cities they're depicting. This is hard for tourists, and has even become a challenge for actual city natives too, because anytime they have to find a new route or station for some new part of the city, they have to scour this map to try to find out where it is. Smartphones again step in here. The best redesigns of these maps seem to be those that are appearing in apps created by metros. You can zoom in, zoom out, it's no issue with it being crowded and hard to read. But the only trouble here is that you need to download these apps, and you have to have signal to use them, and you can't really review things overall. In short, we're in a little bit of a pickle when it comes to mapping out metro systems as they become bigger and more complex today. The use of GPS apps helps, but also confuses, because we're all carrying maps all the time, and those maps don't line up with the printed tube maps. And people have trouble navigating if their signal goes away. So what's the solution to all this? If we're intelligent, creative, and lucky, it might be something as simple as Beck made in the first place. Many people have been trying to redesign the tube maps for the modern day. And actually, New York doesn't use Beck's design. It's one of the only cities in the world to avoid the schematic layout. New York did go through a phase of using a Beck-style map until 1979, when they went back to using a map that was more geographically accurate and used slightly curved lines. This map is definitely not as aesthetically pleasing or readable on first glance, but it also tells you actually where stations are, and that does actually have benefits too, but it's complicated. It's hard to get around how hard these maps are to read, no matter how you lay them out. In the end, the use of these maps now really comes down to the individual user, their knowledge of these types of maps, their knowledge of the cities above, and their access to smartphones and GPS tech. The era of Beck's tube map is still in full swing, and there's no clear solution on the horizon for the problem of these maps just getting bigger and more crazy. What will London do? What will Tokyo do as the map just keeps growing, as public transit increases and the complexity of their systems multiply? Just keep throwing on more stations, making the paper bigger? The London Underground is one of the best examples of a modern map that has truly impacted the consciousness and aesthetic of our world. People love this map, love the way it looks, love how it feels. It's changed how we think about our cities, turning them into places studded with portals, not just with roads. Beck's creativity in joining electrical schematics with cartography is a great example of cross-discipline innovation, and today he's finally acknowledged on the tube maps themselves with a small byline that would probably have tickled his fancy. So we can thank him for his great work and take it forward into whatever the future holds for our cities and our ways of moving around them. Thanks for watching.